Hi, myself Anagha K, Assistant Professor, Department of Microbiology, KSR College of Arts and Science for Women. Today, let's discuss on the topic innate and acquired immunity from the course Immunology and Immunotechnology. Before going deep into this topic, let's discuss on immune system. Immune system is a complex network of organs, cells and proteins that protects our body against infection, and this defense system proceeds by recognition, processing of the foreign substances. The network consists of lymphatic system, complement system, spleen, thymus, bone marrow cells like WBC, B cells and T cells. So let's see innate and adaptive immunity. Innate immunity is quick and non-specific, whereas the adaptive immunity is long-term and specific. In innate immunity, once the infection occurs, there occurs the recognition of the pathogens by the sensors, and these lead to the activation of the cells and inflammation, and at the last, the antigen which invaded the system is removed. Adaptive immunity is long-term and specific, and once the infection is onset, it will lead to the stimulation of T and B cells in the lymphoid organs. These leads to the expansion and activation of the T and B effector cells, and these cells will produce antibodies, and thus the infectious agent is removed. Now let's see one by one deeply. Innate immunity. Innate immunity is a non-specific arm of immune system which is acquired in an immune individual during the birth itself. That is, it is a natural immunity. The innate immunity acts as a barrier against the foreign invading materials, and these barriers form the first line of defense and aiding in the activation and modulation of the adaptive immune response, which is the second immune type response. And the immune system of the body proceeds by the recognition, presentation and processing of the foreign invader, which is followed by the clearance of the antigen. And the components of the innate immunities, there are four major components of the innate immunity. First one is physiological barrier. Physiological barriers are the components like epithelial lining of the skin, mucous membrane, and physical parameters like pH, temperature, and these barriers also include enzymes, antimicrobial peptides, and cytokines. Whereas the anatomical barriers forms many pattern of recognition in which the receptors refers to as pattern recognition receptors can recognize unique molecules present within the microbes called pathogen associated molecular patterns, that is the PAMs. Third component of innate immune system is phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is a endocytosis process in which the foreign body is ingested by the specialized cells known as phagocytes. Phagosomes are formed when these foreign bodies are ingested, which is a vacuole surrounding these bodies. Later on, the phagosomes present within the phagocytes fuse with the phagosomes and form phagoglycosomes. These release the lytic enzymes present in lysosomes, eventually lyses the infectious agents, and hence the infection is cleared. The fourth component is inflammatory response. Inflammatory response are induced by the four features of the host tissues when it gets damaged, and these tissue features include rise in temperature, dolor, that is a pain occurs and a redness color will be present and thus leads to the swelling or the tumor. Histamines, pro-inflammatory cytokines, deficins, etc. are the mediators of the inflammatory responses. So this is the process occurring in the innate immunity, that is, once the pathogen enter the body, it will be recognized by the sensors which will be present in the body of some specialized cells. Or the other kind of pathway is the enzymes, the pathogens will be taken up by the process of phagocytosis, and these signals will be leads to the production of cytokines and interference, which will leads to the activation of further cells, and thus the antigen molecules will be degraded completely, and there's the clearance of the infections occur. These are the components of innate immunity, that is eosinophils, epithelial barriers, mast cells, basophils, and natural killer cells, neutrophils, dendritic cells, complementary system, and macrophages All these cells leads to the innate immunity. The second type of immunity is acquired immunity, or also known as adaptive immunity. This is more specific arm of the immune system, and this process requires specific antigen recognition and is acquired by individuals during his lifetime. That is, it is long-term effect, and it is called as acute immunity. And the mediators of the acquired infection include cellular immunity and humoral immunity. Humoral immunity, serum proteins like antibodies are produced by the B cells, mediated these type of immunity. The humoral immune response protects the body against extracellular infection, that is the infection that occurs due to some other foreign invaders, and thus the activation and differentiation of the B cells into antibody secreting plasma cells occurs when these extracellular antigens are recognized by the body, especially with the help of helper T cells. Helper T cells plays a major role in activating the plasma cells, that is the kind of B cells, and thus the antibodies are produced. Second type is cellular immunity. In this immune response, that is in cellular mediated response, it is mediated by T cells, that is the cellular immunity protects the body against intracellular infections. And the initial step in the cellular response, immune response, involves recognition of the antigen by the phagocytes, and then it is sensitized by the cytotoxic T cells, and finally releasing cytokines in response to that antigens. These are the various steps involved in the adaptive immunity. In this picture we can see an infection, that is a viral infect is get inside the body and thus replicates within the epithelium, and this is recognized by the dendritic cells, and these lead to the interaction leads to the activation of dendritic cells, and then inflammatory tissue will be produced, and these dendritic cells will take up the infection into the lymph node, where the activation of T cells and B cells occurs. B cells activation leads to the formation of plasma cells, and thus antibodies are produced. The antibodies and T cells will attack the virus molecules, and thus the infection is cleared. These are the several differences between innate and acquired immunity. Acquired, in innate immunity, any individual gets this immunity at the birth, whereas the acquired immunity in an individual develops after birth upon exposure and recognition of the foreign antigens. Innate immune response forms the first line of defense, whereas if innate immunity cannot clear the infection, there the acquired immunity is developed. Innate immunity lacks strict recognition, that is, it's non-specific, whereas the acquired immunity is more specific and specific recognition occurs. The innate immune response occurs immediately after the exposure to the foreign bodies, whereas the acquired immunity is relatively late and may take days to week time. Innate immunity involves atomic and physiological barriers. Phagocytosis and cytotoxic cells are involved, whereas the acquired B cells only involves B cells and T lymphocytes. Here in innate immunity, immunological responses are immunological memories is created, whereas the immunological memory develops upon reacting exposure to the pathogen in acquired immunity. Thank you.